Welcome back to The Economist Next Door. I'm your host, Paul Mueller, and today we are tackling a massive shift in the American landscape that happened just 4 or 5 days ago. On February 20th, the Supreme Court handed down a decision in Learning Resources versus Trump that fundamentally changes how trade works in this country. For years, the White House has treated the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, like a magic wand to bypass Congress and slap tariffs on anything they chose. But Chief Justice Roberts just broke the wand. In a 6-3 ruling, the court told the president if you want to tax the American people via tariffs, you need to go through Congress first. It's a return to the power of the purse, a massive blow to government by emergency, and a masterclass in why clear rules matter more than executive whims. Today, we're breaking down what this means for the economy, why the major questions doctrine is the most important legal phrase you've never heard of, and how this constitutional reset bodes well for the future. Let's dive in. All right, well, today I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Dr. Sam Gregg and Dr. Dave Hebert from the American Institute for Economic Research. And we are doing this special episode. We're recording it not that long after a big Supreme Court ruling happened last week. And Sam and Greg have been working on tariff policy, as have I, for years now. And so we wanted to kind of take this chance to go through the high-level landscape, to go into the ruling itself, the response from the administration, and what this means for everyone. So again, to set the context here, February 20th, last Friday, the Supreme Court issued a landmark 6-3 decision in Learning Resources versus Trump that effectively stripped the president of the power to use IEPA as a blank check for tariffs. So the president had argued that he had sort of carte blanche authority. He could set tariffs on any country, change those tariffs, and just do that however he wanted, whenever he wanted, right? But basically no constraints. I mean, there were literally, in the way Trump was using tariffs, there were literally no constraints on what he said or thought he could do in terms of rates, when, how, changing it. And the court basically came in and said, that's not what that statute means. You don't have this carte blanche authority. The power to tax is reserved to Congress. You can't do that. Trump came in and implemented some other tariffs through different sections. But to start it off, Dave, why don't we start with you? What does this mean? How has Trump, maybe let's start with, how has Trump been using tariffs since he took office in his second term? And how is this going to be changing what he can do or how he does it?
Right. So I think it's pretty clear at this point that this administration has used these tariffs for basically anything and everything. We've heard revenue generation. We've heard stopping illegal drugs from entering the nation. We've heard it being used for immigration policy, of all things. We've heard it as a means of reshoring jobs. So to Trump and this administration, it really is kind of the hammer, and everything else in the world is a nail, right? And that's how this administration has used these tariffs. With this ruling, the important thing is that IEPA has been taken away. So the ability of the president to wake up, any morning, find a grievance, and change those tariffs has been severely curtailed. But what we've seen over this past weekend is that really Trump has not stopped with the idea of tariffs. He's going to find new ways to do it.
Well, and maybe if you could just follow up on that for listeners. So what was Trump's immediate response? What did he shift to? What's he trying to do now? And what's kind of that status?
Yeah, so he shifted away from using IEPA and toward using Section 122. Now, Section 122 is a complicated policy. It basically says that the president is allowed to institute up to 15% ad valorem tariffs in order to address sort of a balance of payments deficit. Now, the key part of this rule is that those tariffs can only last for 150 days. And so after that point, they're gone. Now, it's unclear if the president can just reissue as soon as that 150 days is over, or if this is going to be on top of any existing trade deals that are already in place, or if it's going to be supplanting them. It's really just not clear exactly how this one's going to work.
Right. Well, and Sam, so I think a lot of people are concerned about the trade deficit. We've had a big trade deficit for many, many decades. And so some people might think, well, Trump, when he says there's a balance of payment problems, of course there must be because of this trade deficit that we've been running for years. Could you maybe comment on what is a balance of payments crisis? What does that look like? Is that the same thing as running a trade deficit? Are there other things going on here in terms of maybe we don't have a big balance of payments kind of problem? Well, let's see. I'm not sure. I'm not hearing you.
Yeah, I'm not hearing you either.
Okay, you hearing me now?
Yes. All
Okay.
right. Go ahead.
Okay, so when it comes to the subject of the balance of trade, I tend to go back to Adam Smith, who described it as the greatest piece of nonsense that had ever been revisited upon entire populations. So trade deficits are basically where imports exceed exports. And it's really talking about what you might call macroeconomic imbalances, specifically low savings and high investment consumption. But it's not a measure of economic weakness. This is what I think people hear when they hear the phrase deficit, or that we are somehow imbalanced in our trade. The language itself suggests weakness. It suggests that others are getting more from us than we're getting from them. And it doesn't actually matter. It's simply a reflection of the different types of goods and services that are going back and forth between different countries. What matters is that people and countries get what they want, and other people and other countries get what they want. So if anything, it's simply a type of, I guess the best way of describing it is it's like accounting. It doesn't actually tell you anything about the relative economic strength or economic weakness of a given country. It just tells you about the value of the goods and services going back between individuals and countries over a given point of time. But the administration has used a lot of this language, I think, to try and justify not just its trade policies, but also, I think, in the case that was heard and adjudicated by the Supreme Court more recently on the issue of tariffs, the administration were hanging all this on the sense that trade deficits, the fact that we are in a trade deficit to whatever number of countries, is somehow a national emergency. And one of the interesting amicus briefs that was put forward to the Supreme Court basically argued, no, trade deficits are actually natural. They're normal. So if they're natural and they're normal, then they're not an emergency.
Right. Well, and it's hard to say it's been a 30-year, 40-year emergency as well. I think once you get into the decades, it suggests that maybe it's not an imminent threat. But there's a lot to unpack, Sam, I think, in what you bring up here. And, I think when we think about deficits, people might think about the federal budget deficit, which of course is a big problem and is sort of overspending, indebtedness, where the federal government is spending more than it brings in and borrowing like crazy, and the federal debt is growing and interest on that debt is growing. I think a lot of people are worried that that's what a trade deficit means, that we're basically funding consumption today by buying imports. We're spending more money on imports than we're receiving on exports. And so that's that deficit. And so, yes, we're getting the goods that we want, but it's kind of unsustainable, or we're accumulating debt. And there is this idea of what's called the capital account. So, Dave, I want to go to you. Maybe you talk a little bit like, what is the capital account? How do capital flows sort of offset this trade deficit? Are Americans, or is America becoming more indebted over time when we run these trade deficits? Or is there other things, or is the picture a little more complicated?
Right. So it's a great point that you raised. So anytime we're running a trade deficit, we must also be running an equally sized capital account surplus. And the idea is fairly simple. If you look at how GDP is calculated, it's supposed to measure overall production. And the way we do that is by measuring overall spending, which is our sort of proxy, if you will. And so when we buy something from a foreign country, when we import a good, we're going to send money there. That would be the capital account surplus. And we're going to import the good. That would be the trade deficit. Okay? And what it really does, what's really happening here, and the reason why we have to subtract imports at the end of our equation for GDP, is because we've implicitly added them in consumption, investment, and government spending earlier in that equation. It's almost as if we're saying, if you want to get an accurate weight for your body, you should subtract the weight of the shoes that you're wearing. And if you wear heavier shoes, you as a person are not actually heavier. Even if those shoes weigh 1,000 pounds, you still weigh the same amount because your body weighs the same. And that's what GDP is doing. It's subtracting the weight of the shoes to get the weight of the person more accurately.
Yeah, that's a great point. So you're saying that even though imports in the calculation looks like a minus, looks like a cost in some way to the economy, that's actually not the right way to think about it. It's not actually affecting the economy in some kind of negative way. It's this sort of accounting issue in terms of how we calculate it.
Exactly right. And the unfortunate thing is even people at the Bureau of Labor Statistics get this wrong. They put in their releases every month that imports count as a negative, but it doesn't. It's a neutral. It's the same impact on your weight as your shoes.
Yeah. Well, Sam, coming back to you, and I think this is, again, something that people are concerned about, is that the way the capital account works, like Dave was talking about, is we send dollars overseas. We get computers, TVs, parts, all resources. Then foreigners have all those dollars. Some of those dollars they'll buy American goods, and so that will kind of be a wash in terms of measuring the balance of trade. But a lot of those dollars they'll invest back in the United States. Now, historically, a lot of that was invested in government debt. So you have countries like Japan and China that had over $1 trillion, sometimes a couple $1 trillion of national federal government debt that they bought. And so basically we're exchanging dollars to them, getting goods, and then they're giving the dollars back, and we're giving them debt instruments from the federal government that then we're paying interest on. So there's that piece. But then there's also the element that foreigners can take those dollars and they can come and buy U.S. assets, and assets are counted differently. So if they buy a Ford pickup truck, that's counted towards the trade deficit. If they buy a stock or a piece of land or some kind of financial instrument, that's not counted as an export of the United States. That's in this capital account bucket. But could you maybe talk about, should we be worried about foreign ownership of U.S. assets, whether that's factories or national debt or stocks? Certainly foreign ownership has increased pretty dramatic, or has increased in significant ways over the last 30 or 40 years because we've been running this capital surplus in response to the trade deficit. Is that something we should be concerned about? Should we keep track of that? And or is it contributing in other ways to the American economy?
Well, I think when foreigners want to invest in the American economy, that's a good thing. That's a good thing because they are putting capital into the United States economy. That is funding businesses. It is enabling businesses to grow. It's enabling businesses to employ more people, to innovate, etc. And America has been doing this right from the very beginning of the Republic. One of the things that Alexander Hamilton did when he set up the public debt, effectively set up the public debt in the 1790s, was precisely to attract foreign capital to come to the United States so that it would fund all sorts of good things, whether it's businesses, whether it's entrepreneurs, etc., that help the economy to grow. Now, if a foreign entity is buying something like let's say a weapons manufacturing company or something like that, okay, there may be a national security concern if that company is Russian owned or is owned by a company that is fully fledged CCP owned business. That's one thing. But that is not the vast majority of investment that comes from outside the United States into the American economy. It really doesn't matter if the business or the entity is British or French or German or Japanese or South African or whatever. It doesn't matter. What matters is that these companies believe that the United States is a place where they want to invest because they believe that they can make money and in the process of making money contribute growth to the American economy. So with a very narrow set of exceptions, I would say this is not something to be worried about. If people did not want to invest in the United States, that would be a seriously bad sign.
That's right. Well, so you're an example here. If Hyundai builds a manufacturing plant in South Carolina, that's really good for Americans. I mean, even
Yes.
though the company is foreign, you have employment, you have production, it buys resources. I mean, there's all kinds of ways it contributes to growth. And that's kind of the point I wanted to highlight. I don't have the exact numbers here, but I think what might be helpful for people to understand is it is true that foreign ownership of U.S. assets in terms of dollar amounts has gone up by many trillions of dollars over the last 30 or 40 years. But at the same time, the value of total U.S. assets has gone up a ton more, right? So if the total U.S. assets are up, let's say $30 trillion from 40 years ago, and foreign ownership of assets is up $3 trillion, that's a great deal for the U.S., right? So yes, they have a larger share or a larger amount, but we Americans as a country are much wealthier too, and it supports that growth that you're talking about. And the administration is a little bit schizophrenic on this. And so, Dave, coming back to you on this, you know this. I said this from the beginning. You've actually been tracking the numbers a little bit. President Trump loves making deals, and early in his administration, he's like, okay, this country is going to invest $50 billion, and this country is going to invest $200 billion, and this country is going to invest trillions of dollars, and we're all going to. So he's making these deals of foreign investment because he recognizes, Sam, what you're talking about. Like, yeah, we want people to invest here. That's really good. But you can't do that. They need the dollars, and if they're investing it, they're not buying U.S. goods. And what we've actually seen, even with all of the tariffs, is that the U.S. trade deficit has actually increased over 2025 or 2025 and 2026. So, Dave, maybe you could comment on like what the heck's going on here, and is the administration sort of, shooting itself in the foot in a sense of wanting the trade deficit to come down, but trying to bring in hundreds of billions of dollars of foreign investment at the same time?
Well, that's exactly correct, right? I mean, the American economy is a place of investment, and to get those investment dollars, other countries need to have dollars, right? We're not going to take, Chinese yuan or anything and invest that into the NASDAQ or the NYSE. And so,
yeah, that wouldn't go over so well.
Right. And so, or Wall Street as it's coming to be known, right? And so, they need the dollars. Well, how do you get dollars? You sell us things because we're the ones that have dollars, right? And so the exact thing that this trade deficit that we're pointing to is having, the effect it's having, is to increase foreign investment in the U.S. Because here's the thing. When other countries have dollars, what are they going to do with them? I'm sure we've all been to other countries and you walk around with your dollars. What do you do with them? The answer is pretty much nothing, right? So you have kind of two options. You can use it as wallpaper, which would be very expensive wallpaper, or you can use it to purchase something in a place that accepts U.S. dollars. And America is the #1 acceptor of U.S. dollars because it's our currency. So that's exactly what we see happening is as other countries sell us things, they get dollars, and then they use those dollars to invest in the United States.
All right. So long and short of it is we shouldn't really be worried about trade deficits then we should add this caveat that's market driven, right? And so there's an element in which governments can kind of manipulate this, or the creation of lots of government debt, federal debt that has been attracted to foreigners to buy, maybe in some ways has fueled the trade deficit, where they're thinking, do I buy American goods or do I buy this sort of risk-free, stable asset that I can hold? So we don't need to go into that now, but it's something where market-driven decisions, decentralized with prices, we don't need to worry about this because there's these adjustments in profit, and the investment in the U.S. is a good sign. But I want to go back to the ruling that occurred, the Supreme Court ruling. It was an interesting case. It was an interesting split. It was split 6-3, and I was a little bit surprised personally. The three justices who dissented were generally what we think of as maybe conservative judges. So you've got Samuel Alito, you've got Justice Clarence Thomas. And then was it Kavanaugh? I think Kavanaugh also dissented. But then you have three justices who were appointed by Republican presidents who concurred with the three justices appointed by Democratic presidents. So let's maybe jump into the ruling a little bit. What were some of the issues at play, or some of the arguments that were made either by the majority? Maybe let's start with the majority, what they said, and then we'll kind of maybe talk a little about some of the minority concerns and whether we should be worried about that. So, Sam, do you want to maybe kind of frame up maybe a couple of the legal questions that were at play in the decision that was rendered?
Well, I think the most obvious the most obvious constitutional issue that's lying in the background to this is an issue that has been the subject of much debate in constitutional jurisprudence in the United States for quite some time, and that concerns the extent of executive power. According to the Constitution, only Congress is empowered to levy taxes. And it's always been understood that tariffs are a form of taxes. And this is one of the reasons why for decades, Congress was the body that made decisions about things like tariffs. Now, over time, Congress effectively acceded, and you can argue about the constitutionality of that, a lot of that decision-making power to the executive branch on the basis that it's too difficult to get legislatures to come up with a coherent, sane tariff schedule. So therefore, let's have the executive branch do it, and the executive branch can negotiate directly with other countries, and they don't have to second-guess themselves by going back to the Congress to get approval for whatever the president has agreed with other countries. And one of the things that I think that Justice Gorsuch highlighted in his I think, must-read opinion on this particular subject is that the legislature is there to deliberate, and we can't be in the business of saying things are too hard, that issues like tariffs are just too difficult for legislators to consider, so therefore let's just hand this off to the executive so they can make everything simpler. So that's sort of the two deeper questions. One is the extent of executive power and the fact that the administration and previous administrations have relied upon expansive interpretations of executive power, particularly when it comes to anything ranging from trade policy to national security issues, etc. But it's also about the role of Congress in our constitutional setting. And one of the points that Justice Gorsuch was making is that if we are going to be a republic as envisaged by the founders and as it's laid out in the Constitution, then Congress needs to start doing its job. And that's, I guess, the even deeper political issue that's lying in the background, is that in so many issues, not just tariffs, but lots of other questions, Congress has basically ceded its authority voluntarily, because it lets them off the hook from making difficult decisions, right, to the executive branch and to the administrative state. So what this ruling does is basically say, no, you can't be invoking emergency powers to basically do a runaround Congress when it comes to designing tariff policy.
Right. And I think this is where like the major questions doctrine comes in. So people may not have heard of the major questions doctrine, but major questions has sort of been revitalized with a more conservative court that says, Sam, to your point, Congress, you can't just give sort of vague authority to the executive branch. You can't just say, oh, go regulate X and you figure out all the details. Like when it has a major impact on the American people, on their livelihoods, on their freedom, on their ability to trade and exchange, when it has a major impact, that's why I call it major questions, Congress needs to define it. And if they don't define it, the executive doesn't really have authority to do a whole lot until Congress clarifies it. So that was raised by the conservative justices who agreed with this ruling. They said this is a major question. I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars are at play here. International relations are at play here. This is a big deal. Dave, the dissenting view, some of the dissenting views, I think, have to do with whether this is an Article 1 or Article 2 power. So Article 1 is about Congress. Article 2 is about the executive. And in particular, I think Clarence Thomas, in his opinion, argued that, well, tariffs are basically foreign policy. And the president has almost carte blanche when it comes to foreign policy, and therefore he can use this statute to do whatever he wants. And that's a little bit surprising to me. I mean, what do you make of that? Am I interpreting that right? And how is that used in general about foreign policy, saying tariffs are foreign policy as opposed to domestic policy?
Right. So this really gets at the heart of the matter of whether tariffs are an Article 1 or an Article 2 power. Now let's set aside the fact that tariff is mentioned in Article 1. Let's just set that one aside and debate this one, right? So the idea is that a tariff is a foreign-facing tax. At least the legal incidence is supposed to be a foreign-facing tax, right? The economic one, as it turns out, is almost entirely borne by us. But let's set that aside. So because it's a foreign policy, if you will, there is an argument that it could be considered part of Article 2. But it's also a tax, and we know that Article 1 is the taxing power, right? That's Congress. So there's always been this interesting interplay about whether a tariff is a foreign policy or if it's a tax. And what this court decision is saying effectively is that no, it's a tax. It's not different just in a matter of degree from, an outright ban or anything of that sort. It's different in kind. And that's where, Clarence Thomas comes in and says, no, this is a foreign policy and therefore belongs with the president. Now, I will say it's a logical interpretation. It's not one that I personally subscribe to because the definition of a tariff is a tax on imports. And so to me, that places it squarely in Article 1. But I can see where, Justice Thomas is coming from. I just happen to disagree with him.
Another thing to add there is, of course, is that Thomas points to a sort of precedence that these powers have been used in the past by presidents. We should be more deferential towards precedent in this regard. And of course, the other three conservative justices and the three liberal justices said, no, no, a lot of bad things have become precedent, and that doesn't mean we should uphold them. But it's also the argument the broader argument that foreign policy is just exclusively the domain of the executive. No, we have a thing called the Senate, and the Senate actually is supposed to sign off on treaties between the United States and other countries, which doesn't happen very much for some of the same reasons we've had these problems with tariffs. But Congress does have a role in foreign policy. It's not purely an executive function.
Well, and Sam, I was going to ask you too, Thomas is, known for bringing up originalism, the idea of trying to understand the original meaning and the original context. And I also find this really surprising. So he's talking about precedents, but if you go back to the founding era, it doesn't seem like the founders thought tariffs were primarily a foreign policy issue. They recognized there were elements there, but Sam, maybe you can talk about just how important tariffs were in the colonial period and the founding period. This was a big deal, both when it came to the revolution itself and then to the powers of Articles of Confederation and Congress. So maybe you can talk about how is it that tariffs are not just a foreign facing, okay, where do we build an army base or where do we, do it? Well, why is it actually very significant from a domestic standpoint?
Well, it's very significant from a domestic point because, as Dave has said, it's American consumers who end up paying the costs of tariffs. They're the ones who bear the costs of these sorts of things. It's not American business. American businesses, I guess, but American businesses pass these things on to American consumers. Now, President Trump was saying, no company should do this, and I'm going to go after companies that pass these costs on to consumers. Of course, businesses are going to pass these costs on to consumers, so it, by definition, has a domestic feature to it. But, historically speaking, it's probably worth mentioning here that at the time of the founding and the constitutional debates about many of these issues, tariffs, I think it's important to keep in mind here, were the major way in which the federal government raised revenue. There was no income tax, for example. There was no capital gains tax. Tariffs were how governments raised revenue. And that was widely understood at the time. So, and if there's anything that's a domestic policy issue, it's revenue raising for the government so that the government can fulfill certain purposes. So the more you look into the history of tariffs in the United States, whether it's in terms of how the economics of tariffs or the way that tariffs were certainly understood as a form of taxation by the federal government, so it had revenue, these are clearly domestic issues. They are not purely foreign policy, foreign-facing questions.
That's right. And by precedent, it's hard to imagine like a John Adams or Andrew Jackson or these guys just setting tariffs. That would have been, Congress would have lost its mind if they had just sort of like, yeah, we're going to do this. But let's bring it back to where we are today in terms of the U.S. economy. So, Dave, as you mentioned, President Trump has implemented this 10% and then 15% ad valorem tax that has this 150-day window. It's based on this balance of trades, emergency language. Do you have thoughts about, will this be challenged in court? What might the effects be? You said we don't know if they're going to try to renew it at the end of 150 days. What's your sense of what does this maybe mean for how the Trump administration thinks about tariffs or tries to implement tariffs going forward?
Right. So the letter of the law says that it's a balance of payments, deficit essentially, that triggers the eligibility of Section 122. Here's kind of the weird thing, and it's not really a quirk, it's a definitional issue. The balance of payments is by definition always zero. It's the sum of the trade deficit and the current account, right? And so when you have those things, when you add those together, you're always going to get zero. Now, that's not true in a fixed exchange world, which is a bit nuanced and a technical point. But in our floating exchange system, that is always going to be true. It's always going to be zero. And so when you have a statutory requirement that the balance of payments has to be, bad or harmful to the economy to trigger the Section 122, and it's always zero, it's unclear if this is even a constitutional law. So I do expect that this is going to be challenged. I'm not sure who's going to do it or when and where that first court case is going to come out. Then you got, different sections of different laws. So you've got Section 232, 301, 338, 201. You've got all kinds of other legal tricks like reclassifying tariffs as an import fee or anything like that. But here's the bottom line. The more legal tricks or maneuvers or new national emergency declarations that the president uses to try to implement these tariffs again, the more he's going to signal to the rest of the world that America is not to be trusted when it comes to trade agreements. And that's the real cost of these tariffs. It's not the dollars that are being taken from American people. It's not the jobs or the increased prices. It's the loss of trust on the world stage. And that is going to really harm America's standing going forward, even if the next administration apologizes for what we've been doing.
Right. And I think a lot of people think that Trump is just trying to get us a better deal, quote unquote, right? We're being taken advantage of, but actually is undermining trust and creating uncertainty and leading to other kinds of long-term consequences. And this goes back to sort of a deep jurisprudential issue of discretion versus rules and laws. Mm-hmm. And so, Sam, going to you, thinking about this ruling, I think this is, again, a victory for rules over discretion, right? That is to say, we want to have a process, procedure, rules that apply equally to everyone, that are stable, that are known. The famous economist Friedrich Hayek talked a lot about this, the importance of having this kind of rule of law. So maybe you could talk about tariffs and the rule of law and kind of this court case and where things sort of stand now. I mean, I read this as a victory for rule of law, but obviously there's other kinds of problems and a lot of other issues at play right now with the current administration and with the last, 10 administrations. But maybe you could talk about that rule of law element here in this ruling and when it comes to tariffs.
Well, one of the features of rule of law is that it is distinct from the rule of men. So what's the rule of men? The rule of men is when public officials, be they legislators, judges, members of the executive branch, when they behave in an arbitrary manner. So in other words, they don't abide by the rules. They play games. Sometimes it's playing games, so they look for particular pieces of legislation and then hang particular policy things on it. And the foundation is very weak, and that's what has actually happened in this particular case. The administration was basing its case for these tariffs and the way the president was acting in terms of tariff policy based upon emergency legislation, and the court said, no, you can't do that. You don't have the authority to do that. You are not permitted to do this as a question of constitutional law. So I think that's right. It's a victory for the rule of law. And it also illustrates that the way that this administration but also previous administrations of both sides of politics have treated trade policy, it's been operating in a very arbitrary fashion, literally depending upon the whim of the president or whoever happens to have the president's ear at a particular point in time when it comes to the conduct of trade policy. So what matters here, I think, is putting aside the actual issue of tariffs, is the importance of a stable, general, knowable legal framework in which the executive branch, but also the legislature, the way that they frame policy. The moment you start trying to bend the framework to try and get the policy result that you want, then you have the rule of men rather than the rule of law. Now, this is not just a problem that's confined to tariffs. This is a fundamental problem that goes through so much of American politics today. Now, I think we're actually better off than a lot of other countries in this regard, but it is heartening that the Supreme Court essentially made a judgment based upon the framework of what is allowed and what is not allowed under our constitutional system. Now, whether the administration, this administration or future administrations or members of Congress and senators will take the lesson and run with it, or whether they actually try and find other ways of trying to game the system is a different question. My guess is they'll go for the latter. So I suspect, I think as you mentioned, Paul, at some point, whatever the administration does in this regard is going to be challenged. It will take a long time for these things to go through the courts, and we may end up getting more reversals. But, we saw the same thing in the Biden administration when it came to the whole student loan thing, remember? Remember the student loans? The administration basically said, we're just going to keep going until we find a framework through which we can get what we want. And if it takes time for the court system to adjudicate that, so what? So it is a really good testimony to the fact, and this is something I think we stress a lot at AIER, it's not just the rules that matter. The rules are fundamental, but it's also the commitment of the people to obeying and following the rules. That's even more fundamental, because if a population is not willing to do that, or if parts of the policy class, the legislators and executive, basically don't imbibe the spirit of the rule of law, then we have a problem. So I think the court does imbibe the rule of law right now when it comes to these sorts of things. And I find it fascinating, the divide between, it didn't fall down ideological lines. You had three conservatives, three liberals lining up against three other conservatives, which sort of gives me heart, because it tells me that the Supreme Court is no one's tool. It is not just doing what it thinks people in the executive branch or the legislature wanted to do. They're actually having serious discussions about constitutional matters, which, whatever you think of the outcome, and I think it's a good outcome, but even if you disagree with the outcome, it's nice to know that we have a Supreme Court that is actually seriously debating constitutional questions in a serious way and are quite determined not to be pushed around by either Congress or the president in making these types of decisions. That's a good thing for the Republic.
That's right. I think that those constitutional norms you're talking about. So, Dave, you were talking about the erosion of our status internationally. But there's also this erosion of constitutional norms domestically that we should be concerned about not giving up, even in the pursuit of various kinds of policy goals that we might agree with. So, I know we definitely don't have time to go into this in as much detail as we could or I would like to, but we should really address what is good trade policy, right? So, Dave, should we have zero tariffs, or is there maybe a right way to do tariffs if we're going to have tariffs? And so let's start there in terms of what you think, and then we'll go into some objections that I think people or concerns people have about a more free trade oriented policy.
Right. So I'm going to caveat this quite significantly and say that if there are legitimate national security concerns, a case can be made for trade restrictions like tariffs or quotas. Now, it's a slippery slope type of case, and it's nuanced, and it's an important thing to keep that in check, lest we open Pandora's box and find things that we don't want. But I can imagine a scenario where that's true.
Can I ask you about that? So So I think that's right, but I wonder if we could maybe narrow that a little bit. So in my mind, I'm not sure I could see even an edge case where tariffs promote national security. Now, maybe flat out prohibitions, right? Not allowing the export of missiles, for example, or not allow, like I can see kind of flat out prohibitions or restrictions on defense production but I'm not sure like tariffs or quotas. I'm not really sure I would buy that even on anything, whether steel or aluminum. But maybe, I mean, maybe you can make. I mean, other people will make that case. But I wonder if you differentiate between like military kind of technology and weaponry versus, well, we don't have enough, clothespins in case we need to dry our clothes or something like that.
Right. So I would distinguish between those two. And here's what I really think actually matters vis-a-vis national defense. It doesn't matter so much that we produce it ourselves. It matters that we have a consistent and predictable access to the goods that we need. In much the same way that I don't grow food in my backyard, not because I can't, but because I know that I have access to several grocery stores, right? And so even though providing food for my family is of the utmost importance to me, I'm not going to grow my own food and do things independently. I'm going to depend on others because I know I can count on them. And so what I think the protectionists writ large should be concerned about is access. Now, it could be the case that, only domestic production can ensure the access. I'm not going to rule that out entirely. I find it incredibly unlikely, but I'm not going to rule it out, axiomatically here. And so what I would suggest is a tariff barrier or a tariff policy of zero tariffs across the board. The reality is the American worker doesn't need the protection from foreign countries. The real thing is the rest of the world actually needs protection from the incredible productivity that is the American economy. If anyone needs protection, it's them, not us. So lower those barriers. Let us compete with other countries, because here's the thing. We're almost certainly going to win.
There you go. It's a pro-America, America first policy if ever I heard one. Sam, maybe you could jump into on this. I think, there's this narrative that instead of dying, it just gets stronger and stronger over time. You saw it in Marco Rubio's speech to Europe a couple of weeks ago, an otherwise great speech where he's like, yeah, we're not going to let our industries be hollowed out by free trade anymore. So maybe you could comment on, why do we see some declines in some parts of the Midwest, some kinds of manufacturing, right? Is this because we have this free trade policy Dave's talking about, or are there probably a lot of other reasons why Detroit is no longer a big manufacturing hub, or why, we don't have the same kind of steel or production? So people think, okay, we see some diminishment of certain kinds of manufacturing, we see some displacement of workers, we see certain kinds of problems, and they often tend to be related to trade in the sense of foreigners were doing those things better. But to Dave's point, I think that's maybe because a lot of American companies were sort of fighting with a hand behind their back when it came to their labor policy, their sourcing policy, what they can go after. So maybe you could talk about whether trade is something we should be concerned about, being open to trade in terms of hollowing out American manufacturing, or if we should go look elsewhere for problems in manufacturing.
Well, the first thing I'd say is that we don't have hollowed out manufacturing in America. We have not deindustrialized. What's happened to manufacturing, which is where so many of these discussions come back, right? It's like China and manufacturing are the two things that keep coming up in any discussion about trade policy today. But when it comes to manufacturing, what has been the biggest change is technology. Technology, the fact that we are so far in front of the rest of the world when it comes to technological development, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. It's made us productive. This is where our comparative advantage lies. We're really good at making high-tech manufacturing and exporting it to other countries. It creates American jobs. It's just very, very good for the American economy. We're still one of the top 3 manufacturing countries in the world. We have not, I can't say this enough, we have not deindustrialized. What's happened is that the nature of manufacturing has changed, and it's changed in good ways because it reflects our comparative advantage, it reflects technological change, etc. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, yes, there are parts of the country in which we've seen cities, regions which had once large manufacturing sectors, Michigan would be a good example. Pennsylvania would be an example where things have changed, and where we've seen certain types of jobs go away and have been replaced by other types of jobs, albeit not as many jobs as existed before. That's partly because of technology, but also I don't think we can discount what you mentioned, this hand tied behind our back. There's really very good evidence showing things like, if you're trying to understand why car manufacturing is not doing so well in, say, places like Michigan, Detroit, you mentioned Detroit, and why it's flourishing in the southern states, Arkansas, Alabama, etc. What's the big difference? The big difference is unions, the power of unions, the power that unions exerted in the manufacturing sector, with, I would add, a lot of complacency by management who just went along with all this and who wouldn't challenge what they knew to be the damaging effects of this monopoly of unions upon effectively the nature of a lot of the work that was being done, the slowness in adapting to competition from abroad, etc. I don't think you can underestimate the damage that unions and restrictions on the labor market have done to manufacturing. And we can see it in our own country. It's flourishing in southern states because they don't have big unions. These are often right-to-work states as well. And guess what? Whenever unions go down to the southern states and they try to unionize the workforces, what's fascinating is that the workers reject this. They don't want unions because they look at places, the traditional Rust Belt states, and they say, that is not what we want. We know what happened. We know unions were part of this. So I think when we talk about many of these questions, rather than worrying about what other countries are doing, the fact that they're working, they're doing different things, they're finding their own comparative advantage, we shouldn't be worrying about that. We should be worrying about the bad policies that we have domestically that undermine our ability to compete in the global economy. Dave's right. We have nothing to fear from the global economy. If American workers and American entrepreneurs are allowed to be free and can operate within the type of rule of law framework that we talk about all the time at AIR, we're unbeatable.
That's right. I mean, it's ironic. I mean, we believe in America more than the NatCons believe in America in a lot of ways, in the American economy.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. We actually have, those of us who believe in markets, I think generally speaking, we are much more optimistic about America and have much more faith in ordinary Americans than those on the other side of the debate, who I think have a very pessimistic view of Americans and a very negative view of the American body politic. We're the optimists.
That's right.
Well, let me give you a quick statistic here on this. So everyone says that China is this manufacturing superpower, right? They produce somewhere between 60% and 100% more output than we do. But they use 212 million workers in manufacturing to do so. The US, by comparison, we only have 12.7 million workers. In other words, China uses 16 times as many people to produce only 60%, maybe twice as much stuff as we do. That's incredible. That's a sign of how amazing the American worker actually is.
That's right, that productivity. Well, and you know, Sam, when you were talking, something I hadn't really connected before, but I think is maybe relevant to this conversation, why this narrative continues to exist, is because many fewer people are in manufacturing than used to be. So you could have had people argue in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, or today, man, we used to be an agricultural nation and now we're not an agricultural nation. And that would be true in the sense of, yeah, like half of people lived and worked on farms in 1900, and today it's, 2%. But it would be wrong to say we're producing less food. We're producing far more food than we ever have throughout history. So it'd be weird to say, yeah, we're not an agricultural nation anymore. Most people don't work in agriculture. They're not very exposed to agriculture. But man, we have a lot of agricultural output. And I think something similar has happened in manufacturing, where in the 60s and 70s, you have a pretty big share of the population, relatively big share of the population, actually in and affected by manufacturing jobs. And as you mentioned with technology, that number has diminished as services and other kinds of innovations have increased, but the manufacturing output has not declined. It's only grown and is very significant. So I'm going to use that example now.
Yeah. So the service sector has grown immensely since the 1970s. And guess what? It's people get paid higher wages there. It's the type of work that people do is nowhere physically as demanding as the type of work that was in agriculture or manufacturing. This is the direction you want an economy to grow. And the good news is that it doesn't mean that this has been at the expense of manufacturing productivity. Manufacturing productivity has also grown immensely over this same period of time, as the rest of the other sectors of the economy have also been growing in terms of productivity, and particularly in the services in terms of jobs and employment. So it's a very, when you look at it this way, it's a very positive story that I think those of us who believe in markets are incumbent upon. It's incumbent upon us to explain this in ways so that we can combat this sort of doom and gloom, very negative, pessimistic view of the economy, and even more importantly, of Americans that we're hearing from economic nationalists on the right and on the left today.
There you go. So listeners, you don't need to be afraid of free trade, right? It's the rest of the world that should be worried about that. Well, Sam, Greg, Dave, Hebert, thank you for joining me for this conversation. I appreciate it. And thank you for joining us for another episode of The Economist Next Door. All right. I'll go and
nice
stop
job,
recording
guys.
here.
Yeah.